Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April webinar of the Task Force for American Democracy. I am Mary Smith, President of the Task Force and a past president of the American Bar Association. In the run-up to the 2026 midterms, the Task Force is conducting a special series of programs with a focus on elections and voting. And for our second program in the series, we are thrilled to be joined by Task Force member Richard Haass to discuss lessons to be learned from other countries that have fought back against authoritarian forces and how these tactics might be employed in the U.S. There's so much to talk about. He will also discuss current events like the war in Iran, our actions in Venezuela, and much more. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Task Force member Richard Haass. He is arguably the personification of the American foreign policy establishment and one of the most influential international relations strategists in the world. He has served four American presidents in various capacities: Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. He was Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and the Principal Advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He is President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he served as president for 20 years. In 2013, he served as chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. And for his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. His latest book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, which was published in 2023, we're going to discuss today. It became a New York Times bestseller. He's also the author of a weekly newsletter published on Substack. And so without further ado, Richard, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to correct one thing you said today, which is I never worked for Bill Clinton. I've played golf with Bill Clinton, never worked with him.
Okay.
I did work for Jimmy Carter in the Pentagon. He was the Democratic president I worked for. Just to check the record here.
Oh, great. It's still four.
It's still four. We exactly. We have to trade one Democrat president for another.
Right. Let's start off. I mean, there's so many current events. Obviously, we had another assassination attempt this weekend on President Trump. And I wanted to ask from your perspective, looking across the globe and certainly in the US, have we seen an increase in political violence in the United States, do you think?
Well, we've seen it. It's not just an opinion. There's statistics and data to support it. Some people emphasize the availability of weaponry. I would say, though, there's another thing going on. I don't think enough people have delegitimized it. And one of the things I actually write about in the Bill of Obligations is the obligations of various people in American society to use their pulpits, in this case, literally. I think that every religious leader should be out there saying, no matter how strongly we disagree on this or that issue, nothing ever justifies turning to violence. We need our political leaders to do that. Every leader one can think of in this society, because there'll always be weapons, there'll always be means. And what I think we have to really do is delegitimize political violence, because by any and every measure, it's been growing against judges, against elected officials. There's been now 3 attempts that we know of against President Trump's life. And what worries me, if God forbid any of these attempts prove successful, I fear that violence will beget violence. There'll be retaliation or reciprocity, whatever word you want to use. So it really is something that's got to be tamped down.
No, that's a great point. And is there anything like an average citizen can do to help with that effort?
Well, again, I think, whether you're an average citizen as a parent or an average citizen in this or that social group or this or that citizen in a classroom or in the workplace or in a house of worship, one can voice or support the voicing of the delegitimization of political violence. And anytime one hears even casual comments about it, uh, you know, we all have to think about what we do when someone says something, say that's particularly racist or particularly this or that against any group. Well, I think we've also got to call out even casual comments about political violence. I just don't think there's a place for it in American society.
Well, yeah, that's a huge subject, but I do want to turn to the war in Iran. I'll just start off. Is this war constitutional and legal?
Well, this is not a war that's been declared as a war. The Constitution, as you know, has a methodology for doing that. It hasn't been done. And by the way, that's not an exception. We very rarely declare war anymore. You're more likely to have snow in July than you are to have formal declarations of war. All presidents operate in a certain gray area when it comes to the use of military force. And this president very much is in that tradition. This is a larger undertaking, but then again, other quote unquote conflicts or wars in recent years have also not been carried out against the backdrop of a formal declaration of war. So I don't see this as an exception, for better or worse. I see this as the rule. Just to say one other thing, it's over 50 years since Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote his famous essay and book about the imperial presidency. And that was done during a different war, Vietnam, that again wasn't authorized through the formal constitutional process. So this is nothing new. And what we see is president after president exercising this what he believes is his authority to employ and deploy American military forces around the globe.
Well, how long do you think this conflict will last, and what is the way out of it?
Look, the good news is after it's about 8 weeks going on now. Basically, it's been 2 months. We've got a ceasefire. That's the good news. The bad news is the Strait of Hormuz is still closed to use. The United States has instituted a blockade, which is something I suggested and support in response to Iran's assertion of control over the strait. A lot of issues are outstanding. Negotiations are right now or has been suspended. So I would expect at the moment the ceasefire could last, though it's tenuous. But I think it could last because I don't believe either side sees an upside or an advantage to the resumption of hostilities. We've almost run out of military targets. And the danger is if we were to resume hostilities, Iran could choose to retaliate against the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Kuwait or Bahrain or Qatar. And everybody would be worse off of that. So I think we're likely to be in a no war, no peace situation for some time, though, again, as we speak, Iran has reportedly put forward the idea of agreeing first to a new arrangement for the Strait of Hormuz, where that would be open. The administration seems to be resisting it. I've advocated in my newsletter and Home and Away that the United States ought to support that in principle, see if we can agree on the details, and then over time turn to the nuclear issues so long as Iran does not change the physical status of its nuclear materials and capabilities. But that's essentially where we are. And I would not have predicted on the basis of national security logic this war would happen. So it makes it hard for me to predict when it will end.
At this point, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're kind of thinking about solutions going forward in two pieces. The first, addressing the Strait of Hormuz, and then secondarily, the nuclear issue with Iran.
Quite possible. Let me just say two things. That would still leave out a lot of other pieces. And there's questions about whether and where, for example, you might deal with Iran's support for proxy forces like Hezbollah, Hamas, whether you would deal anywhere with Iran's rebuilding of its conventional military capabilities, its ballistic missiles, or its drones. There's the question of financial transfers to Iran based upon frozen assets or relieving sanctions. So there's a lot of questions there. And then second of all, wars end in lots of ways. And what you might call the formal battleship Missouri or the Appomattox form of war termination is actually the exception in many cases. And I can imagine this war ending without anything so formal. Maybe again there'll be some kind of an arrangement about the Strait of Hormuz. I don't know what there'll be when it comes to the nuclear issue. And then obviously there could be certain issues that are not included in any agreement. And what you would have instead is a kind of signaling or implicit understandings about red lines. And if certain lines were crossed, what might be the repercussions?
Mhm. Well, I wanted to ask about, we've seen a weakening of the rule of law in the United States in recent years. In fact, the World Justice Project ranks the United States 27th out of 143 countries. Do you see this as well? How do you see this trend?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a trend. And the most common term of art is democratic backsliding. And if you had, what's the word, metrics or matrices of democracy, the U.S. looks, democracy here is less robust, less admirable today than it was a decade or 2 decades ago. We're not unique in that. We're seeing a certain backsliding around the world, in part, by the way, because the American example is not as strong. And we now have a foreign policy that does not actively promote democracy around the world. We've eliminated our funding for certain activities and the like. But yeah, the net result is exactly what your question posited, which is that democracy in this country has lost ground. The good news is we still have a democracy in this country, and it's quite resilient. And maybe we'll talk about Hungary, but one of the promising or encouraging trends there is even democracies that deteriorate, that they still show real resilience and an ability to resist encroachment.
Well, you actually anticipated my next question, Richard, because we recently saw that Viktor Orban lost his election. And I was wondering, should we be heartened by that? Do you think it's start of a new trend, or is that just particular to Hungary?
No, I've asked myself the same question. Should we be heartened by it? Absolutely. It shows that even after 16 years, uh, the people, the voters, are willing and able to push back if given a chance. In this case, I think three things contributed to what happened. One was the poor economic performance. Two was the visible corruption. And thirdly was simply time. That after 16 years, people were more than ready for a change. There's an irony in this, is that often these populists of the right come into power, but then if they stay in power long enough, they become the establishment. And the
Mhm.
pendulum swings and the forces of change work against them. So, are there some encouraging things for us? Just that. It shows that, one, people will be held accountable for poor economic performance. Bread and butter issues still dominate democratic politics. Second of all, people get and can relate to corruption. And thirdly, the pendulum swings. The tendency over time is, it's almost Newtonian. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. At some point, the forces for change, and whether the establishment is of the left or the right, it doesn't matter. And we've seen this in places like Argentina. You see political rotation in a lot of societies, and outsiders become insiders, and vice versa.
Well, you mentioned earlier the U.S. foreign policy and how we are not as actively promoting democracy with the cuts in USAID and other things. So, how would you characterize the current administration's foreign policy, and are we abiding by international law?
Well, first of all, this administration has gone out of its way to de-emphasize the promotion of human rights and democracy. When you read the national security strategy that was issued late in 2025, late last year, it's quite explicit about it. Even earlier, I think it was in the spring of 2025, when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia, he made remarks that basically said, we're not going to tell you how to run your own country. We're not going to tell you how to govern your citizens. So it's a distinctly, I guess you'd call it, amoral foreign policy. And you know, I don't see that. I don't see that changing. And I apologize. I've now forgotten your question because I filibustered so long.
My question was, how would you characterize the current administration's foreign policy?
Right. I guess of all questions, I of all people should remember that. Look, again, I'd return to the national security strategy, which is quite a revealing document, a surprising focus on the Western Hemisphere, uncharacteristic, a real focus on commercial transactions. Previous administrations were largely content to have conditions of stability, believing that if we had that, then the United States would more than hold its own when it came to trade, investment, what have you. This administration takes a much narrower, more focused, more transactional approach. There's a real anti-European bias to this administration's foreign policy and anti-alliance orientation. I would say, obviously, a heavy use of tariffs, a hostility to international institutions. I would say questions of international law get little, if any, attention by this administration. What's ironic, though, is where we are with Iran. And when you read the national security strategy, there's an explicit language about pulling back from the Middle East. And here the administration finds itself heavily involved in a war in the Middle East, in Iran. And the only way I can square that with what it says is that this was unintentional, in the sense that, yes, they intentionally went to war, but all their assumptions is that this was going to be quick and easy. This was going to be, if you will, Venezuela in the Middle East. And it didn't turn out that way. Virtually all of their assumptions about Iran and how the war would unfold and how Iran would respond and so forth were proven wrong. It shows in some ways what happens when you hollow out the institutions where expertise is normally found, when you don't have a rigorous process in government. So this is, oddly enough, the Iran war is the exception that still reinforces, I think, the general rules of this administration's foreign policy. I just say one of the things that you raised, that in my experience, say at the State Department, elsewhere, the role of international law is quite modest. The legal advisor at the State Department is not one of the most influential principals. It's a consideration, but it's simply not one that is determinative. It's not one that tends to win out against others. Essentially, policy or politics tend to prevail much more than legal considerations, and often legal considerations are selectively marshaled, no pun intended there, in order to strengthen the politics or to build support for the policy.
And that's across both Democratic and Republican administrations. You're seeing that.
Yeah, in my experience, that might be unfair, and I may not have been privy to some things. You never know what you don't know. But by and large, I've never seen a situation where the legal consideration, I would say never, I very rarely saw it. I saw it at times in the Carter administration, but I would say that was more the exception.
Mm-hmm. Well, with everything happening in the world, and we've seen recently Putin meeting with Iranian leaders, the United States has been for many years the superpower. Are we seeing a reordering of the world order? Is this the beginning of a new world order?
Well, I think it's the way I put it is more that we've moved away from a world order that was largely intact for 8 decades, essentially the post-World War II world order. It continued in large part, not entirely, but in large part after the end of the Cold War. It's been about 3.5 decades or so since that. But I think we're beginning to see, yes, a serious weakening of that world order. The Russian multiple invasions of Ukraine, for one thing, the breakdown of the functioning of international institutions, whether it's the World Health Organization during COVID, or now the United States moving away from the World Trade Organization, uses of force that are more and more unilateral, which is another feature of this administration's foreign policy. So I can see it's easier for me to answer what we've moved away from. It's much more difficult to make the argument about what we're moving toward, whether it will be in order or to what extent there's a degree of disorder, what will be the nature of the order. I think that's very much up for grabs. That's what makes this, on one hand, a really interesting moment if you're a student of international relations. There's first order questions of foreign policy at stake, but it also makes it a concerning moment simply because my guess is we're going to look back on these last 7-8 decades and see them as something of a golden age without great power conflict, where the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction was quite limited. Their use was non-existent after World War II. We saw a lot of people enjoying degrees of freedom that were unprecedented, people living longer lives, healthier lives, wealthier lives. And my concern is looking forward. It's not going to be nearly as good. And a lot is going to depend upon the behavior of the United States, because this country, largely for better, had an outsized role, both as the architect as well as what you might call the general contractor of world order over these 8 decades. And increasingly, there's questions about our willingness, not our ability, but our willingness to continue to play this role. And I don't see anybody else willing and able to replace us. Certainly not as a promoter of an order that we would see as desirable. So we're in I think, an extremely, again, worrisome, concerning moment of international relations, where what's in front of us is less clear and potentially less desirable than what is behind us.
And you talked a little bit about your view of the current administration's foreign policy. Do you see an element of colonialism in there? Because there's been talk of Canada, Greenland, and Cuba.
A little bit. I wouldn't quite use the word colonialism, but I don't know how seriously to take those things. But the United States essentially led the world over the last 8 decades through essentially a consensual foreign policy, where allies and partners were more than happy to be allies and partners because we made the relationship one that served their interests. What I'm seeing now is an American foreign policy that's much more coercive, whether it's using economic instruments or like tariffs or sanctions, whether it's berating foreign leaders, or whether it's using military force. So again, much more coercive. And also a certain interest in accessing, whether it's energy reserves, say in Venezuela, but gaining economic benefit. So it's not quite colonial in the sense, but I would say it is to some extent imperialist. And it's a different kind of foreign policy. It's not one that I'm enthusiastic about. I think it's short-sighted, but it does represent a different tendency. How long-lasting it will be, whether, for example, it'll survive this administration, I don't know, but it definitely represents a departure.
Well, so many things happen fast and furious, particularly domestically and internationally, and a lot of the focus now is on Iran, and people, I think Venezuela has exceeded from the headlines, but I wanted to just ask about our actions in Venezuela. Do you view our actions in Venezuela lawful? And I'm including both the lethal strikes on the civilian boats and then our capture of Nicolas Maduro.
The short answer is no. I don't see a legal basis for these things. I would have thought that a lot of these things, that's why we have a Coast Guard, or it could have fallen the boats into a law enforcement type thing. And I never thought the justification for intervening in Venezuela was persuasive. And their role in, for example, the drug trade was relatively modest and so forth. And I worry about reinforcing this precedent of great power intervention. I don't think it was warranted here, and I worry about the lessons others would take. Like, since you raised it, maybe I didn't give a complete answer before, also about Iran. Iran seems to me a classic case of preventive war with a V rather than preemptive. And international law, as you know, does not put a lot of weight on preventive war. That's against gathering threats. Well, virtually any country could say we see a gathering threat in our neighbor and we're going to intervene. And that seems to be a world of anarchy and growing conflict. So I don't think in this case the United States and Iran had a sufficient prerequisite or justification for acting. There was nothing new that Iran was doing that rose to the level where of an imminent threat emerging that what Michael Walzer once called anticipatory self-defense. I didn't see anything that rose even close to that level. So I worry when you take Venezuela and Iran together that we're lowering the threshold of essentially what constitutes a casus belli. And I think that simply makes war potentially more commonplace. And I can't see how that is a good thing for us or for anybody else.
Well, you've just kind of summarized some of our actions internationally and trying to have preventative wars. Do you think the actions by the United States internationally impact or reflect our actions with respect to the rule of law that is applied domestically?
That's interesting. I thought you were going somewhere else. I thought you were going to ask me whether it affects how others around the world act, and the answer is maybe. No, domestically, I'd have to think about it, but I largely see them as different. I would simply say, though, this is not an administration, the second Trump administration, that tends to place legal matters as a priority. We've already discussed it a bit with their foreign policy. Domestically, the widespread use of executive orders raises certain questions. What I would call the politicization or the weaponization of certain executive departments, including the Justice Department. So this is, to some extent, it goes back to our earlier conversation, there's elements of illiberalness, your backsliding question, we've become a less liberal in the classic sense of the word democracy over the last 15 or so months, and probably over the last decade. And there's things that have been done that you can argue whether they're quote unquote illegal, but you can argue, for example, like the use of the pardon power and so forth. It was not what was intended, I would argue, when the Constitution was written. And it makes a larger point. Maybe I'm not a lawyer, so it's easy for me to make this point, which is it shows the limits of law in a democracy. The analogy that I remember once hearing is, when you do your taxes, there's the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. And it's one thing to do tax avoidance. Obviously, it's illegal to do tax evasion. That's one context. But in a democracy, even not doing things that are illegal doesn't mean they're necessarily good for a democracy. That's where norms come in. That's where character comes in. That's where self-restraint comes in. And it shows the difficulty of designing a democracy. And I think our founders, in some ways, predicted this, and they didn't know how to solve their own dilemma, if you will, which is you cannot anticipate every person who might come into power or everything that might be done by any person in power, that laws only take you so far. And at some point, and if the checks and balances aren't operating as they might, and they're clearly not now, then you are very dependent on self-restraint and character. And I would simply say that's one of the challenges we now face.
Well, you've kind of mentioned it, our founders, and we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And you have touched on it on your previous answer, but do you think if the founders were alive today, What do you think their perspective on the framework they set up would be?
I think first of all, they'd be pretty pleased that this thing they set up lasted 250 years. It wasn't obvious at the time, and there's any number of quotes from a lot of the early leaders. They were quite negative about the prospects of this democracy. The idea that we'd not just survive, but more often than not, we thrive, both at home and abroad. This country is a remarkable domestic and international success. And one of the reasons of that is also our ability to evolve, to change, not so much through the formal amendment process, though that has been incredibly important at times, particularly when it came to the extension of individual rights and liberties, but just as a process, as a society, as a set of governing systems. So my hunch is their overall reaction would be pretty positive. My guess is none of them could have imagined anything remotely like where we are. On the other hand, they would probably identify things that would give them cause for concern. And again, when checks and balances aren't working, or the assertion of executive power, and with the absence of pushback, certainly from the legislative branch, and a quite deferential Supreme Court. We could go around other aspects of American democracy. So I think I don't think in that sense they'd be surprised. And the idea that at the end of the day, democracy, they were worried about factions, so all the politics they would get. They understood the importance of character in human interaction and so forth. So even though a lot of the specifics were obviously beyond their ability to predict or anticipate, my guess is there's a lot they'd probably nod their heads at and go, yeah, well, we were somewhat concerned about it. We didn't know how to build in surefire protections against it. But all that said, I would still think after 250 years, they would have to be more pleased than not.
Well, wanted to talk about authoritarianism generally. People have said that it's harder to recognize than it used to be. So in the 21st century, most autocrats are actually elected rather than violently suppressing opposition like Castro or Pinochet. Today's autocrats convert public institutions into political weapons, using law enforcement, tax and regulatory agencies to punish opponents. And it's been called competitive authoritarianism, a system in which parties compete in elections, but the systematic abuse of the incumbent's power tilts the playing field. What are your thoughts on this?
I think there's a lot of truth to it, and we see it in truly authoritarian systems like a Russia, but you also see it in places like Turkey. We saw it to a large extent in Hungary, to some extent in Poland. We see it around the world where you have the veneer, if you will, of democracy. But underneath that veneer, there's many things that are going on that are partially or more than partially undemocratic, but you have concentrations of power. You have use of government authorities and powers for personal or partisan purposes. The media's role as a kind of its ability to provide transparency gets limited. You have things for example, in our country, problems with gerrymandering and the rest, or the use of money in politics that weaken the political process. So I think the answer is, again, you can call it competitive authoritarian behavior. You can call it democratic backsliding. You can see it the liberalization of democracy. I think these are all pretty much the same thing, that there's nothing, how would I put it, the continuance of democracies as full-fledged democracies it's not on autopilot. It's a constant struggle. And what we see is a range of outcomes in various societies, to some extent depending upon the individuals who happen to be on the scene, to some extent depending upon the architecture of the government. And certain systems seem to have slightly more what's built-in resistance or resilience to them than others. But I think every democracy or partial democracy around the world is being, what's the word, is being buffeted from within. And my guess is also that some of the social media and the rest hasn't made it any easier. It's made it harder in some ways to build consensus, and it's made it less difficult for certain illiberal extreme views to gain traction.
How would we know if the United States crossed the line into authoritarianism?
Well, again, my immediate response is almost like pornography, to go back to the court. We'll know it when we see it.
Yeah.
Uh, Look, I would say probably the truest test, and we may have it, is our ability to conduct free and fair elections.
Mhm.
Because what free and fair elections give a democracy is a chance to recreate itself, to cleanse itself, to change policies, to push back against concentrations of power by those who are wielding it. They bring about rotations uh, of power. Now, for an election to be free and fair, it requires several things. One is obviously the ability of all those who are eligible to vote to vote. Second of all, it requires that there be sufficient access of information, in the sense that access to media and so forth, that there's a, if you will, a level playing field in which the election takes place. So it's not enough just to have a free vote on election day, if there's a day, as there is in this country, but the run up to the election has to be one where, again, those who are entitled to vote get a fair chance to vote, and there's a level playing field when it comes to access to information. And then after the votes have to be tabulated honestly. There's got to be the integrity of the process. We could well have a test on some of those or all of those this November in the United States. So I would think if we pass that test, then I think we're in pretty good shape, because that suggests to me that the center, if you will, the democracy can hold. But if we have a situation where a lot of eligible voters are one way or another denied the chance to vote, if the playing field isn't particularly level, lots of ways it can be distorted. If obviously there's not election integrity in terms of the handling of votes that have been made and so forth, then we've got a real problem on our hands, because then you get the institutionalization of power rather than a rotation of power, if that's what the voters want. So I think we'll know a lot more in November.
Well, as we're heading into November, you've laid out some of the parameters of free and fair elections, like everybody being able to vote, everyone having access to information, the votes being tabulated. And we've seen threats, I think, on all those fronts, because we've seen possible legislation that would require additional documentation for people, many of whom don't have that. We've seen the possible, efforts to, in some ways, federalize elections that are normally done at the state level. If you had to predict, do you think that the attacks on our elections are more severe and fundamentally different than we've seen in previous election cycles?
Yeah, always hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But yeah, I mean, I worry. Let me just be clear. I'm not against documentation, that individuals
Mhm.
should have to show that, but it's got to be done in a way that it doesn't become a mechanism for denying people the ability to vote, simply because that documentation cannot be made available in the time span that exists. So if people said we're going to take, for example, the next 4.5 years to deal with getting people various forms of documentation, uh, even though I think this is solving a problem that doesn't exist. I haven't seen evidence of meaningful fraud, but be that as it may, I don't think the documentation issue is per se wrong. I just think that it's got to be done in a way where its implementation does not become, if you will, a mechanism for denying people vote. So if it's instituted for this November, then we've got a problem. If it's instituted for 2028 or 30 or whatever, then I think it's potentially fair, so long as, again, it's implemented in an efficient and even way. Providing security at polling places is legitimate. Election workers and voters deserve it, but the security, we have to be sure, isn't used to intimidate. Now, we can go through a lot of things about voting by mail and so forth. The goal ought to be, again, we want to facilitate voting in this country by anyone who's eligible to vote. We don't necessarily want to go to the Australian model where voting is mandatory. Americans wouldn't take to that. But I find it disheartening that even in the last elections, over 80 million Americans who are eligible to vote didn't. So I want to see voting encouraged and facilitated by anyone who has the right to vote, and then I want to make sure that their votes are counted honestly. I think that's something we owe them. But yeah, I think the fact that we're having this conversation is to some extent reflective of the reality that we're not so confident we can take any of this for granted anymore. That this is now something we do have to worry about in terms of people being barred from voting either directly or indirectly through certain requirements that can't be met, or certain types of presence of ICE or police forces or military forces that might have the effect of intimidating, or people, or some of these forces would seize voting machines, not to protect their integrity, but, if you will, to challenge their integrity. So again, a lot's going to play out between now and November, and I think this will be in our 250th year. This is going to be a critical moment for American democracy.
Well, I want to talk about your book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, and it was published in 2023. What caused you to write it in the first instance?
It wasn't obvious that here I am, this foreign policy guy, was going to write this book. But increasingly, I began to think that as much as I worry about China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and terrorists and what have you, I began to think that the biggest security challenge facing the United States was our society, was ourselves. And that our lack of an ability to come together to meet our domestic and international challenges. So I came to this basically saying we've got to deal with our internal challenges, and above all, our challenges to work together politically if we're going to ever be able to meet the policy challenges domestically and internationally. And I was increasingly worried, quite honestly, that we were showing ever increasing signs of not being able to come together sufficiently to meet these domestic and international challenges.
Well, in the time since you wrote the book, do you think things have improved or deteriorated?
I think you know the answer to your own question. I wish I could say they improved, but I think, by and large, they haven't. We began the conversation talking about political violence. That's gotten worse. I think the polarization has gotten worse. What we've seen Congress, I would argue, over the last 15 months has not met its constitutional obligations. It's as if somebody has a redacted form of the Constitution, and Article 1 seems to have been left out. I could go on and on. So I think, by and large, American democracy, however you'd measure it, is not working as well today as it was several years ago. I worry about the extensive use of executive orders and executive authorities, essentially do an end run around the political system. The one thing, though, I am encouraged by is there's more and more people who are talking about this. When I go around the country, and I talk about two issues in particular, maybe we'll get to those. One is the need for civics education in our schools, and I get an awful lot of people nodding, and I'm beginning to see this movement picking up a little bit of steam at the secondary level, but also at the college level. There's a lot of interest also in public service. So I think more and more Americans know that there's something that there's something wrong, that this thing, here we are, we're celebrating, we're marking our 250th, but that we can't take it for granted. And so what I'm encouraged about, is the recognition that we do have a problem. And before you can start solving one, you've got to recognize it. So I take that as something of a good sign.
Well, you have 10 obligations in your book. Can you talk about a couple of them that you think are the most important?
Yeah, and in the spirit of Thomas Jefferson, I'd begin with the first, and that's why I made it the first, which is to be informed. Jefferson always thought that was the most important aspect of citizenry, of citizenship, and I think he's right. Before you get involved, which is the second obligation, as much as I want citizens to be involved, I want them to first get informed, to understand the issues. If you're going to vote, to understand not just the issues, but the differences between or among candidates, because in a representative system, you're choosing people who will make all sorts of judgments and decisions on your behalf. So yeah, the most important thing I would say is to get informed, and that leaves me. We could have a long conversation about education in this country, but I just think that increasingly we're letting ourselves down. Public education has got to be improved in this country. It is not even close to what it needs to be, full stop, across the board. And as a result, for too many Americans, the American dream has become a dream. It's no longer a reality. And education is going to be more important than ever going forward, because the pace of technological change will mean that jobs are going to be churned at a greater rate, and we're going to have lifelong education in order to prepare Americans for their next job and the job after that. So, one thing again is we need an informed electorate, which is linked to another obligation, which is teaching civics. I simply believe that you should not get a diploma from high school or college without having had a mandatory civics course. We wouldn't think of graduating young people who couldn't read or write or get online. Why do we think it's okay that they not understand the basic rights and obligations of citizenship? So I think this ought to be part and parcel, again, of middle school, high school, college education. As I said, the second obligation is one of getting involved. We already talked a little bit about the lack of voter participation. There's lots of other ways to get involved, which leads again to another obligation, which is public service. Government shouldn't be this thing that is disparaged. I hate the phrase deep state. Government is us. It's ourselves, it's our neighbors, it's our friends, it's our family. We ought to want the best and brightest in this country to serve, because government makes a difference in our lives. And we have this extraordinary military, in part because so many talented people have signed up for it. Well, I want our diplomatic corps and our intelligence and the rest to be just as good, and frankly, they're not. I never liked the idea of Doge, the idea that we needed to root out all these people. No, we want to encourage talent to come into government. We want to encourage talent to stay. We want people to get involved. Again, there's a whole menu of ways people can get involved. We've already talked about a few of the other obligations about no political violence. I'm a great believer in civility, that we can learn to disagree without turning that into enemies. And I kind of then scoot ahead to the 10th. If the first obligation is to get informed and second is to get involved, the last is to put country before self or party. The idea that we really need a patriotism where we put this country first. And I'd like to think, and here in our 250th year, what better moment to rededicate ourselves to this idea that the country is more important than partisan politics or our own personal ambitions. And unfortunately, I have to say this, because let me just sort of say, we don't lack for examples where personal ambition or partisanship seems to be coming first.
Well, you've talked about getting involved, and obviously you've mentioned voting, but for our audience, can you just give some other suggestions of how people can get involved?
Oh, sure. voting is the most obvious. And again, I'm struck by how many people don't. Another would be just to push your school boards to have civics. That's
Mhm.
something we can all do. People show up at school board meetings, or people pay a hefty fee so junior can go to college. Well, why not spend a little bit of time on what is taught and learned in those schools? And why can't civics be part of the curriculum? Why not have more public service opportunities? We don't need a draft, but incentivized public service opportunities could be domestically. God knows we have enough problems where we need people to work in them, or internationally. Voting is one thing we talked about. What about election workers? What about getting involved in politics to get more people who are eligible to vote to get them registered? So I don't see, or I mentioned before, get involved in terms of career choices. Again, I'd love to see the best and the brightest go into the military, the State Department, the intelligence community, what have you. You don't have to make it a career. Make it a stint. For me, I've been lucky. I've worked, 4 presidents. I've worked on the Hill. It's been an unbelievable opportunity. Some of the most interesting work I've been fortunate enough to do. Um, and one of the great things about the American system is you can go in and out. You don't have to make a permanent decision that I'm only going to have a government career or I'm only going to be outside. We have a degree of flexibility. Each president, for example, gets at least 4,000 or so appointments to senior jobs around the government. So I would like to see more talented people get involved in government. Again, we want the most talented not just to go to Silicon Valley or to Wall Street. We want the most talented to go do something that helps all of us.
Well, you've talked about civics, and I know you've developed a civics curriculum. Could you tell us a little bit about it, and if people wanted to access it, where could they get it?
Yeah, yeah, I was traveling around the country after publishing the book, and I talked about one of the obligations being to support the teaching of civics. And one of the questions I got was, okay, that sounds good, but what do we actually teach? And I'm not qualified. So what I finally decided to do was to back up my words with actions. And so I read a lot and talked to a lot of people and looked at all sorts of syllabi, I think I got the plural right, out there, and put together my own. And I put together a syllabus for a normal semester course, 40 odd hours. You can chop it up into 12 or 14 weeks and so forth. That's sort of a full 3 credit college course. I've come up with a 1 credit course that can meet, I think it's for 14 hours, essentially a third as much time. There's also a shorter version which could be taught, say, for what's called first year experience, that when students show up on campus, or could just be done at any time during the school year. You could have a couple of mini conferences, if you will, where all students are exposed to it. So I've put this together. What's different? It's got really 2 emphases. One is what I think is a foundational grounding in the ideas that are central to the American democratic experience, and access to some of the basic reading and so forth, Constitution, Declaration, but also some Supreme Court decisions, Federalist Papers, what have you. And then secondly, a law about obligations, not just about rights, but again, to continue this conversation, because it's what democracy requires of all of us if it's going to function. And what I've tried to do is do it in a way where a lot of the work is done in simulations. So there's at least, for example, in the full semester course, there's more than a half dozen simulations in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So it's very active education. It's not just students, as if you will, being lectured to or absorbing material out of books, but I wanted them to, if you will, put their democratic muscles, or build democratic muscles. So learn civility, learn how to get informed, debate with one another, and so forth. And one of the simulations, for example, is a mock constitutional convention. and that we'd have a new one and people get to put forward their ideas for how we'd amend the Constitution. The last one, which I think has potential to be really valuable, is a mock student senate. And it takes whatever institution they're part of, whether it's a high school, a college, what have you, and it takes the laws, the rules, how that institution is governed, and allows them to debate amendments to that, as if they were, again, the equivalent would be a constitutional convention for the university or the college or the high school. And again, what I want them to do is to get informed, to practice all these skills that are central to a liberal arts education, but to get involved in this. I'm building a whole website, which will be up soon, to make it available. In the meantime, I've sent it to hundreds of educators, but I will have it out on a website pretty quickly, so it can be downloaded and I can continue to update it. And I'll make all this clear through my Substack, Home and Away. I'll include all the information in there.
Oh, thanks, Richard. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. So as we're kind of coming to the end, I wanted to ask you a last one or two questions. As we end, what gives you hope for the future of American democracy?
Look, what gives me hope is one, that we're here after 250 years. We've achieved things that goes back to our previous conversation. Our founders never, I think, imagined in their wildest dreams. We've shown the ability more than anything to self-correct. And I think that's the great structural advantage of democracy. It's not that we don't get things wrong. Of course we do. Indeed, this was implicit in the whole idea of building a more perfect union. That was a recognition that what we had built was imperfect. But as we've seen with things like the civil rights movement, earlier the 14th Amendment, extending the right to vote, and so forth, that we're able to fix what's wrong. Authoritarian systems often can't. So that's what gives me hope more than anything, is that we've got we have the demonstrated ability to recognize mistakes and then act on them.
And is there any final thoughts you want to leave our audience with today?
I want to leave them with the basic thing about getting informed and getting involved. I expect, given who you are and the auspices of this, we've got a lot of people watching this who are pretty well informed. But democracy is not a spectator sport. We need people to get involved, and there's so many ways to make a difference, whether it's in the political process or more broadly. Everybody's in a community, in contexts and situations where what they say and what they do can make a difference. It's almost as if de Tocqueville walked into their living rooms and would see things that they were saying and doing and go, I recognize that. That's very much an American sort of thing, where individuals take responsibility for, even have a sense of shared ownership of this democracy. So I would hope that the people watching this would basically go away and ask themselves, okay, what can I do to make a difference here? What can I do in whatever worlds I operate in? And if enough people do that, we'll not just celebrate our 250th, but we'll celebrate our 350th and beyond.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's a wonderful way to end this. And thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your expertise. This was such an incredible conversation. Thank you again. So everyone, if you enjoyed this program, which I know you all have, please go to the Task Force for American Democracy's website at www.democracy-taskforce.org and sign up for our newsletter. And actually this week, because it's Law Day on May 1st, this Friday, we're going to be presenting a special webinar this Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And we will be joined by the Task Force co-chair, Judge Michael Ludick, and Task Force members, Judge Nancy Gertner and Judge Tom Griffin. And they will be discussing the importance of Law Day, particularly this year, as we are also celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Richard, for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.